Cameron Logan is an urban and architectural historian and director of the postgraduate program in heritage conservation in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. His work is concerned with historicity of the built environment and the civic and cultural claims connected with architectural and urban conservation. He is the author of Historic Capital, Preservation, Race and Real Estate in Washington, D.C. from 2017, co-author of Architecture and the Modern Hospital, 2019, and co-editor of Adapt, New Lives for Old Buildings, 2024. So Cameron is lecturing on locating Giurgola, Rome, Philadelphia, and Canberra. Cameron.
Thanks, Bill. And just give me a shout if you can't hear me over the drums. But I'll do my best to speak up. So yeah, as Bill mentioned, I was here in 2019 to convene a symposium in honor of my doctoral supervisor, Richard Longstone. It's a festschrift, really, or that type of event. Richard hadn't taught here and I hadn't attended here, so that was a little bit weird on one level, but it all made sense. And one of the connections, of course, was to Bill Whitaker, who was connected to Richard. And as he mentioned, he sidled up to me pretty quickly at that event and said, "Who's doing work on Giurgola?" And I said, didn't have a writer chapter. I mean, basically, in the end, I pointed to, I think, one symposium that had happened in Australia in 2010 that Aldo attended, that my colleagues Anne-Marie Brennan and Paolo Tombesi had convened. And I said, but as far as a sort of dedicated research project, exhibition, book project, I really can't see it. And it so happened that a few months later, I think it might have been even a few months before this, the Secretary of Parliamentary Services, the top bureaucrat in charge of running the Parliament, had invited some of us to come to Parliament House to talk about what's known about the building in terms of its architectural history. And so they kind of sought input from us. We went down there, we talked to them. That was pretty unpleasant overall. But nevertheless, partly because of that, but most particularly because of what Bill had said, we kind of set about, and it sort of planted a seed that we should set about doing something more on this figure who is fundamentally important there. By there, I mean in Canberra, but we also understood him to be important elsewhere, and that actually joining that up was a significant thing to do. So, what in a sense that sorry, it's still a bit. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. So in a sense, what that led us to ask is, how we could locate Romaldo Giurgola, really. We locate him, in geography and architectural history. What can we do? And so, but it was essentially that seed that was planted by Bill that set us on that path. Now, that path, before I embark in a sense on Aldo's itinerary and what he actually did and how I guess we can link him up across those different places. I want to make a couple of quick acknowledgements. Firstly, that those discussions led not just to taking up an interest in Aldo Giurgola myself, but also the formation of a project. This one that Bill mentioned, funded by the Australian Research Council and led out of the University of Sydney, where I'm based. And it's a substantial team. We've got 2 members here, our American partners, but we have several others who can't be with us. Some of them might be on Zoom. Hello to you out there in Zoom land. And thank you to you all for being here this evening, and to those also who've joined us that way. I should also acknowledge, I've already mentioned Bill, and Bill's mentioned Denise and the work we've done over the last couple of days, which has been tremendously stimulating. And just being here and being in the Architectural Archives has been a great privilege. So thanks to both Denise and Bill, sincerely, and thanks also to Frank Matero and Randy Mason, who facilitated my being here at the University of Pennsylvania for these several weeks, and also to Micah and Laney in particular for helping me navigate some of the vagaries of visiting, visas and access to buildings and so forth. And thank you all for your interest in this evening. Okay, so as with any architect who produces a significant body of work, there are multiple ways of approaching that work and trying to understand its significance. And I want to mention three possibilities, three or four, in fact, that myself and others in the group have noted before laying out in a bit more detail the approach I've privileged in the project in looking, in trying to locate Giurgola. In looking at Giurgola's work, one might focus on the several tectonic habits or devices to which he returned throughout his career. And I've had discussions with some of you about some of these devices this evening. For example, he loved the detached wall as a way of layering an elevation or articulating a boundary in a way that makes an inhabited edge of the building a kind of transitional or mediated space. And you see this, well, we see this repeatedly every night on our news, the front elevation of Australian Parliament House. And there you can see the way that actually works internally. But it's there in a different way, in a sort of reduced scale at the Volvo headquarters in Gothenburg, project from a similar period. It's there at the Tradition Library, which we've just been looking at. Many of you who were downstairs saw these drawings. And even in a very different sense at Penn Mutual, this, you know, what preservationists might scorn as facadism is in a sense this tectonic habit or this, you know, this design habit of actually just using a detached wall as sort of mediating device between street or a landscape and the building as such. And even perhaps at a bit of a stretch, we might even regard that in the same way, Walnut Street car park. So equally, you know, so this is one way of approaching him or thinking about him through these sort of tectonic devices, and he uses wrapped columns and some other things that are characteristic of the work, and that's most characteristic, I suppose, of Australian Parliament House. But equally, we could focus on modes of architectural representation. For Giurgola, the perspective drawing was undoubtedly a key to generating architectural designs. The competition entries for Boston City Hall, that's not the right project, that's the right project. Because, yeah, one more detached wall, in fact, here, in a very late project for a little house for himself in a place called Lake Bathurst outside Canberra. But yeah, the perspective drawing is something that's very significant for him. And you see these drawings as powerful components of competition entries, in which he and the firm are prolific, you know, in the early 60s and beyond. The new headquarters, the AIA in Washington, DC, you know, a competition-winning entry, unbuilt as it turns out, reasons I won't go into here. And in both these projects, our research team has recently been writing about. And they were both imagined very much as urban projects and depended on perspective drawings to communicate his conception of those places from specifically determined points of view. Those perspectives definitely encouraged an idea that the proposed new buildings were always also fragments of a larger city or landscape. But this did not lead Giurgola to an aesthetics of fragmentation. In fact, these projects are all about compositional synthesis and integration. The perspective for Giurgola is about generating a realism, I guess is one way of thinking about it, in urban and landscape experience through the architectural design process, rather than simply generating attractive drawings, although they very much are attractive drawings, as many of us have just seen downstairs. Or a third way we could consider Giurgola's work and approach him, I suppose, is thinking about the way he manipulates space and light in his work, his interest in daylighting from above, and, sorry, last couple of perspectives. One, unbuilt Acadia Visitor Centre in Maine, and the Vice-Chancellor's residence, another Canberra project from later on, where he's still, of course, using very detailed perspective drawings as both generative and documentary, I suppose, for these projects. Or, as I said, we could consider the way he manipulates space and light in the work, his interest in daylighting from above, Again, that was something we discussed at least briefly downstairs, and certainly something we've been discussing over the last couple of days. And conversely, providing glimpses of the sky. It's striking in several of these projects, including the Wright Brothers Memorial Visitor Centre, which we were looking at in a very different way here in the entrance vestibule at the Volvo headquarters in Gothenburg. And that, I just include that one. It's the same just detail, just because I like that picture. And here in a different element of the Volvo headquarters, this sort of top lit corridor, the same or very similar detail appearing in the Liberty Bell project. Again, right here, right directly on axis, right at the center of that project in the middle of Independence Mall. And you can see that there, sadly, no longer with us. Project, that is. And possibly even, one final way I'd suggest that you might approach his work and think about him is through his sources. And this is a bit of a left field one. It's not 100% clear when he first became interested in the medieval churches of Västergötland in Sweden, but he was determinedly interested in these and ultimately wrote about it and tried to publish his thoughts about them in several major American journals. The editors weren't as enthusiastic, it turned out, about this topic. But I think looking carefully at these buildings does actually teach us a little bit about his own habits and design. And I did have a look at some of these buildings when I was lucky enough to be in Sweden last year. And most obviously, I think, in terms of just making one simple comparison, is his propensity for sort of modeling the form of the building by using deep window reveals. And perhaps the link to United Fund building might be a little bit tendentious or tenuous here, but I think if you look across a whole series of projects, that propensity to use those deep reveals to give this sense of mass in a wall that I think is characteristic of the projects, you see that, well, his interest in those medieval churches either came from the fact that he had a propensity to want to sort of feel that expressive massivity of the walls that you find in those churches, or he really developed it as a source. I don't know, I can't say for sure. But again, this is just another way we might think about him. All these approaches, I'd suggest, can yield valuable insights into Giurgola's career, and they all play some part in how our project approaches the architect and his work. But tonight, and in the project more broadly, I want to foreground cities or the urban situation as the primary lens for locating Giurgola. Now, before I consider the specific cities that shaped him most, and as flagged, I'm going to suggest those are Rome, Philadelphia, and Canberra. And if there's any New Yorkers in the room, we can take up that fight later, but I'm going to suggest it's those three. But before I do, I want to raise one further question that is prompted by the biographical sort of framing, in a sense, or by the sort of biographical problematic. And that's the question of how to locate Giurgola in those places, how to do so. In undertaking a life and work study, we might conventionally assert that we are looking at the cities that shaped Giurgola through his eyes, or attempting to see the world from his standpoint, right? That's the sort of conventional way that we might say we're going to understand our biographical subject. But it's of course naive to think that we can do biography in that way. Virginia Woolf's biographer, or one of the more significant of her biographers, of course there are many, Hermione Lee, who is also a historian of biography, argues that any biographical narrative is an artificial construct. In other words, we're not given the world that our biographical subject inhabits. And in fact, when we come to represent that world, it no longer exists in any real, tangible sense. But in the case of a significant artist, I guess I'll make that claim on behalf of Aldo Giurgola, what we do have are their artistic concerns. For Lee, Woolf's biography could be organised around the writer's clear preoccupations and novelistic strategies for assessing the interior lives of her characters, which were her ways of approaching her great themes. Woolf's great themes are time, memory, and perspective. So if we can't see through Giurgola's eyes in any real sense, how do we access his preoccupations, which were, incidentally, to a significant extent, time, memory, and perspective? Though not in his case at the personal psychological level, but more at the collective material and urbanistic level. I think those themes, those preoccupations, those concerns emerge. So it's quite different, obviously, to Virginia Woolf. But there are a couple of main ways of doing that, I think, of accessing this viewpoint, or what's he worried, what's he concerned with? First and most obviously, I draw on his own writing and the many public addresses he delivered in his life. In addition, we also have discovered things, the project that is, about Giurgola's life from his colleagues, and it's been a great pleasure to meet more this evening and last night, his niece Katerina and others that knew him and worked with him. This, of course, includes things that Giurgola himself never wrote or spoke about. So we're also attempting as far as possible to form a picture of his life in architecture through the eyes of others. And then, of course, there's the work. But for that, I'm kind of going to make a little bit of an apology and say, well, we got that downstairs. And I'm going to talk about work, but I'm just on this trip during my time in Philadelphia coming to see that work, much of it for the first time, and the body of drawings that sits underneath it. So I'll ask your, I guess, patience for the book or something to properly process and understand that work. And so what I'm going to do, rely on mostly tonight, is his writing to open up the prospects and angles of approach to his architectural personality and to locate him in the cities that form the itinerary of his life. So cities, after that rather lengthy introduction to the main meal. Romaldo Giurgola was born in Rome in 1920, and his father Vincenzo was an architect and artist, and at various times maintained a workspace in the Propylea, in the Piazzale Flaminio, and also kept another atelier in the ancient walls. And Paolo Tombesi has learned about these spaces from Aldo's niece, Caterina. At age 19, Aldo... Oh, no, sorry, we missed some there. Oh, no, sorry. So his father, this was supposed to refer to his father's career. He was involved in several sort of monumental projects for the municipality, including the Vittoriana, the monumental cheese that William Holford referred to, the great monument of the 1930s, and indeed casting the bronze horses that adorn that work. And his father, I should note, was intrinsic to that project, and here he is, third from the left, enjoying a dinner inside the horse. And thanks to Paolo for sharing these classic images. So after serving, so that's where I jumped forward to. At age 19, Aldo travelled north to visit his great architectural hero at the time, Gunnar Asplund, and his work in Sweden. And this shifted his attention again and added a different kind of awareness of the natural world that would come to shape his work in many important ways, or at least so he narrates it. And something that helps to see and understand the approach to Australian Parliament House, among other projects, and to understand his long engagement as well with Volvo. He travelled to Sweden on a number of occasions throughout his life, and developed a relationship with the longtime Volvo chief, Gyllenhammar. I'm not saying that right, but the kind of Volvo prince of the 70s in particular, and the 80s. So after serving with an engineers corps in World War II, Aldo completed his study under Gustavo Giovannoni at the University of Rome, with his final project being a restoration and set of additions for this. No, that drawing's missing. Sorry, that one got away from me. For a palazzo there, the Palazzo Penitenziario and the Via della now my Italian's really falling apart, Conciliazione. He achieved what appears to be a surprising degree of early success in this phase of his career, and indeed perhaps a surprising amount of responsibility immediately following his graduation, when he's just in his mid to late 20s, completing projects for the church, including this one, Santa Liberata at Francavilla al Mare on the Adriatic coast. And there it is more recently. So when we consider his childhood milieu and his education, it's hardly surprising that in his writing, Giurgola, and later on the sort of public addresses that he gave, he frequently situated himself rhetorically in Rome, looking out onto the city sort of through his juvenile eyes. In most of these recollections, the city is an accumulation of material and spatial impressions, rather than a series of works of architecture as such. Writing in 1981, he recalled, "My Rome was cobblestone on an undulating floor, following the shape of the earth. Then it was cobblestone becoming travertine, eroded and full of the holes of time, smooth like the wax of the old candles in the churches. And my Rome was travertine, changing into sculpture in the air, angels and saints ready to fly, ready to step suddenly into the big October clouds. The real moulder, as in making of a mould, was atmosphere," he goes on, "working with those flying forms, shaping the profile of the building and streets into precise pieces of sky." And hence we come back to his propensity to want to have us look at the sky in many of the projects. It's a very romantic, almost Ruskinian evocation of materials, architectural form and nature, right down to the observations of climate and atmosphere. But for Giurgola, the somewhat misty-eyed evocation of the past is no mere nostalgia. His recollections are framed as considerations of what one must do as an architect. And he's equally, and for him, a historically contingent and spatially unique set of human and physical phenomena in a city must form the parameters for any architectural design. Those parameters are the basis for revealing order in a place, which is, he asserts, the task of each work of architecture. Order comes, Giurgola wrote in a piece for the Yale Journal Prospector in 1964, from a realistic apprehension of the facts that make the city. Ultimately, I think his method is to fuse this deeply personal artistic response to a set of accumulated impressions with a sense of the material reality that prompts or underpins those impressions. The historian Filippo Di Domenicis, writing very recently about that Prospector article from 1964, noted that in the piece, Aldo, and I quote, "distances himself convincingly and conveniently from any pedigree in the name of a realism hidden in the folds of the city and its architecture." So his father, Vincenzo, literally worked enfolded in the city walls. And Aldo approached architecture first and foremost as an attentiveness to the existing facts and fissures of an urban situation. Okay, here we finally get here, Philly. Now, Giurgola doesn't make his way directly from Rome to Philadelphia. He first travels to the United States to study at Columbia University on a Fulbright. Once he completes his study there, he obtains work teaching at Cornell, and significantly for the next phase of his life, he finds a sympathetic social and cultural setting among Italian expatriate artists in New York. Again, I'm grateful for the work being done by Paolo Tombesi and Filippo Di Domenicis with Giurgola's niece Caterina to piece this phase of Giurgola's life together. The notable figure in the circle that Giurgola kind of became part of seems to have been the sculptor Costantino Nivola, whose East Hampton house became a kind of landscape-centered salon for this group. Nivola was art director for the journal Interiors in the latter years of World War II, helping to shift its direction by orienting it to recent developments in Europe and bringing it closer to emerging concerns in the visual arts. In 1952, Aldo produced his first cover for the journal. It's the one on the left. And from 1954, he was appointed as art director for the publication, not taking over directly from Nivola, but in this line of Italians who are influencing the direction of this publication. And it's worth noting that in his 3 or more years in this role as art director for Interiors, he also invited a contribution from a range of significant visual artists, including, somewhat to my surprise, Andy Warhol and a range of others. In the same year he took on that job, 1954, that job of art director for interiors, he obtained a position as assistant professor in architecture here at Penn and begins working for the architecture and engineering firm Ballant and Klaus. Is it Ballant or Ballante? Ballanty and Klaus. Incidentally, Ian McHarg also arrives here in 1954, and Kahn is appointed professor here in 1956, to mention just two of the key figures that converged on this school in the 1950s and 1960s. So Giurgola comes to Philadelphia in the middle of Holmes Perkins' campaign to build a formidable architecture and planning school, and finds himself in the midst of a highly stimulating debate ranging across architecture, cities and landscapes, and that manifests, and this is something certainly Bill has been very insistent on in the kind of studio jury setting as much as it does in seminar or publication. This set of questions and problems, I guess, for architecture in the 1950s. Giurgola's big break architecturally was the Wright Brothers Memorial Visitor Centre, which those of you who were downstairs have been looking at. At Kitty Hawk for the National Park Service, usually dated as 1958 to 1960. It was part of the Mission 66 program that aimed to dramatically improve visitor amenity in time for the 50th anniversary celebration of the Park Service in 66. Sorry, just a couple of the other covers from interiors. These are the ones he did himself, not just the ones he commissioned. We see some concerns with religious motifs coming through them. So, you know, I wanted to highlight some these attractive drawings for the Wright Brothers project, although we've seen even more and even better in some ways downstairs. So I won't dwell on them. But as Bill noted to those who are downstairs, this is perhaps a man who's still got a little bit more time on his side than he would for later projects, and so there's just this beautiful attentiveness to what's in these images. The Wright Brothers project led to the formation of the partnership with M&B Mitchell, a partnership that initially also included Warren W. Cunningham. And I should note here that our project is very conscious of its Giurgola-centrism, coming as it does from the Australian end of his career. One of the things I'm working on here with Bill is a way to recognise appropriately the contribution of others to Mitchell Giurgola, not least that of Mitch himself. And my colleagues are conducting interviews with former colleagues of Giurgola, as I mentioned before, and Anne-Marie Brennan, one of the colleagues who's part of the team who visits the Philadelphia area regularly, has already undertaken several, including one with Dan. So by the early 1960s, Aldo begins to write more, or at least more of his writing finds its way into publication. His growing reputation as a designer and educator affords him the opportunity to articulate publicly his view of architecture, and he's particularly insistent around the importance of the relationship between architecture and cities, as I've mentioned. Two articles published in 62 and 64 respectively outline a set of concerns that echo through all of his subsequent writing and his many public addresses. And there were a huge range of public addresses in the 1980s, in particular, after he's won the gold medal for the Institute here, after he's been appointed as the architect for Australian Parliament House. He's talking all the time. A lot of those don't end up in publication, but we have all of the typescripts for these in the National Library of Australia and have read most of them. The 1964 piece, you know, but those two earlier pieces, in some ways, they set his themes, I think, and you see those played out and echoed through the later addresses and work. But in this group of articles he writes between 62 and 64, you sort of see the seeds of all the important ideas that become his lifelong themes. In the 1964 piece for Perspective, I've already mentioned that piece, but the earlier of the two articles, Architecture in Change, was published as part of a special issue of Journal of Architectural Education, JAE, which carried the title The Architect and the City, and was first presented as part of an AIA seminar at Cranbrook Academy. In that essay, Giurgola rejected, you know, what he called totalizing technical solutions or schematization. He's talking here partly about that approach to city planning. and referring to the American urban context, affirmed the power, and I'm quoting, vigour and stability of the 19th century city centre. My observations, he noted towards the end of the paper, lead me to three conclusions. The representation of the city is of an artistic order. There is no one method for the construction of the city, and the interiors, and the third, the interior space determine the form of the city. The first two of these conclusions are readily explicable, I think. That the representation of the city as an artistic order was simply his way of reaffirming the artistic and compositional role of the architect in the process of defining key places in a city. His second conclusion, that there is no one method for the construction of the city, affirmed his commitment to the importance of attentiveness to the urbanistic or landscape condition over and above a theory or set position, if you like, theoretical commitment. One could perhaps argue that this in itself is a theoretical commitment, and it would come to seem more so as his sympathy with, I suppose, a sort of phenomenological influence in architectural discourse became more evident by the late 70s and early 80s. But I'm going to leave that aside for now, for this talk. And it's his third conclusion that I want to focus on, because I think this is the thing which illuminates something about the position he tried to take up in Philadelphia about making this city. So the third of his three conclusions from Architecture and Change, that the interior spaces determine the form of the city, is perhaps less obvious in its implications. But it brings us into the heart of a question about how to think about the form and quality of Philadelphia. Well, he doesn't elaborate in particularly helpful way in that article itself. He does say more in a third piece from the period, also published in 1964, with a somewhat awkward title, Early Stages in an Idea in Architecture, published in the journal Dimension. There he argues against the contemporary tendency to think that utilitarian or infrastructural buildings can serve essential civic purposes. For this, he says, has ever been a failure. And I quote, I didn't include that. Reference points, pivots of urban movement and exchange, they must retain a symbolic character, represent, identify the citizens if they are to be of real interest as a spiritual or physical focus. The Rome of the Baroque age was planned in that way, with large streets linking distant points, but those foci were indeed basilicas and sanctuaries, town halls, and so on. You cannot make a gas tank or a parking garage a meaningful place, no matter how large. The reference to Kahn's idea for Philadelphia, I think, are hard to miss here, and I feel somewhat blasphemous in saying so and pointing out the conflict in this space. But indeed, I think it's fairly clear that he disagreed, in a sense, with some of the ways Kahn sought to resolve the problem of the new sort of patterns of movement in the city, and to store the vehicle and to use those vehicular storage places as great sort of monumental markers within the city fabric. Now, at the very same time that he wrote this, that Giurgola rejected this sort of approach, he was busy finding ways to harness and store motor vehicles in his own work. But he insisted on just drawing a clear distinction between people, nature, and machines whenever he spoke about architecture. Well, we must accommodate the latter, he acknowledged, architecture, machines, that is. Architecture should be addressed to the former, to nature and to people. In other words, we should not expect these garages to become meaningful places. Moreover, for all the sublime potential embedded in Philadelphia's increasingly obsolete industrial infrastructure, Giurgola did not share the enthusiasm of key figures in 20th century architecture who saw such places as exemplary for the forms of the 20th century city, and think, Gropius and later Banham, sort of valorizing, in a sense, the American industrial landscape as a kind of source of form making. For Giurgola, the extent to which Philadelphia was incomplete, or to which its infinite extension called for purposeful spatial definition, this problem could not be addressed or resolved by reference to great objects in themselves, acting as monumental markers. The key reference and pivot points had to engage people in some meaningful activity. The manner of drawing his Philadelphia projects testifies to his and the firm's interest in historic civic centres of the city as continuing in some way to perform this function as pivots. So while this is kind of mega structural, this proposal for East Market, the way he draws it, of course, draws key attention to City Hall. Likewise, here in a very subtle little detail that perhaps not many people have experienced on the roof of the United Fund building, one is drawn and again back to City Hall. But we hardly need to confirm that Philadelphia in the late 20th century is not the same, or in the mid to late 20th century is not the same as Baroque Rome, which he cites as an exemplar. It's quite clear, for example, that basilicas would not play such an important role in the civic and ceremonial life of this city. So Aldo engaged enthusiastically with the architectural and urban opportunities presented by the bicentenary and the focus on Philadelphia that came with that, but the manner of marking that anniversary and the broader logic of tourism and leisure in which history had become something to be viewed, a parade of significant objects, if you like, representing the past, was also something he probably found, and I say probably because I don't know this for sure, a little bit disquieting. He tended to see the delineation of past as highly distinct from the and separate from the present and as a sort of special domain as harmful to both past and present. He wanted to insist much more on continuity of past and present and engagement between past and present. In 1967, he suffered a dispiriting conflict with Gordon Bunshaft that helps illuminate the point. At that time, Bunshaft was on Washington's Commission of Fine Arts and objected strenuously to Giurgola's proposed manner for situating the new AIA headquarters building in relation to its historic premises in the Octagon, a grand house from the early 19th century and a key historic landmark in Washington. I won't go into Bunshaft's objections, but Aldo's comments toward the end of that process reveal his own view about the relationship between past and present, historic places and contemporary responsibilities and commitments. In one of his final remarks to the Commission of Fine Arts in this whole sort of saga that really dragged on from about 65 to 68, before he resigned the commission for that job, seeing the impasse with the commission as unresolvable, he said the following: "We endorsed since the beginning," sorry, I won't try and do it in his Italian accent, but it comes through quite strongly in the particular syntax of this quote. "We endorsed since the beginning the attitude of making a building which included the old, not separate. I think a great deal of harm is given by the fact that you are thinking always of one building beside the other building, finished in themselves. The sense that something greater might be achieved through a closer sense of engagement between past and present in cities was a commitment he carried over into questions of landscape as well, and ultimately informed his view of how to approach the design of Australian Parliament House, which in a sense, as Bill suggested to me when we first met earlier last week, can be considered kind of as an addition or adaptation of the original landscape sense and plan of Canberra. That is, it is of course a compositionally unified complex in itself, but the way I think Aldo thought of it was also as a sort of adaptation and remaking, and a remaking in the spirit of the Griffin plan for the city. So again, sorry, that was just to highlight or underline again this interest in bringing our attention visually to the key civic markers of life in Philadelphia. But I suppose I included that image to highlight his sense that, is it more than sort of tourists staring at a bell? When we kind of separate out or situate the past as an object separate from the city. Not to say he didn't want to celebrate the bell or he wasn't interested in this project. It's simply to say perhaps this vision of history as this sort of spectacle, a sort of parade, if you like, of sort of the bicentennial celebration doesn't quite gel with the larger vision he had, I think, to integrate past and present. Okay. Finally, and briefly, I promise, I want to turn to Canberra, the city for which Giurgola designed his most significant building and ultimately had the greatest impact at the urbanistic scale, at the urban scale. Australian Parliament House has a double identity. On the one hand, it's a free-floating signifier for national public affairs and politics in Australia, the background to countless TV news stories every week, functioning in much the same way as the dome of the US Capitol does. The building locates a TV audience in the capital city, in Canberra, but the city in those stories is meant in a narrow sense as the activities of political parties and decision makers. But again, and this is a little bit like the dome, the Capitol Dome as well, Australian Parliament House has a second identity as a powerful urban landmark and point of orientation for those actually in Canberra and not just watching it on TV. To a remarkable degree, the Parliament complex makes you feel that the city was developed around it rather than it responding to the city. It achieves this not simply by its siting on a hill and its landmark mast or flagpole, but also through integration with the landscape and the existing urban structure that had been set into that landscape, vaguely by reference to the Griffin Plan. Italo Giurgola thought won the competition to design the new and permanent Parliament House, as it was known at the time, and was subsequently appointed as its architects. Aldo commuted back and forth between New York, where he'd been based since being appointed as the head of architecture at Columbia in the late 60s, and Canberra, but eventually moved to Canberra on a permanent basis somewhere around 1984. Although if anyone knows for sure, I'd love to know when it was. And it was there that he would spend the rest of his life. This may have appeared from here to be an unusual choice. Where he'd been at the centre of things academically and architecturally in Philadelphia and New York, Canberra must have felt like exile at times, teaching at the University of Canberra on occasion, the former College of Advanced Education, and walking the city's semi-deserted streets. But there he could also watch the slow motion formation of another of his cherished conceptions of the city. In this case, the city as ordered by nature. Aldo had long admired Walter Belly Griffin and Marin Marnie's plan for Canberra, which he'd first encountered as a student in Italy, and the opportunity to play a part in the development of what was, in effect, a new city still by the late 1970s and early 80s, and act as a key steward for carrying the Griffin conception forward, clearly appealed to him. When invited to deliver the Walter Belly Griffin Memorial Lecture in 1982, Aldo obviously didn't hesitate. In his address, he argues that Canberra is one of the few rewarding answers to the vexing urbanistic questions of the day, those of movement, and I quote, movement, urbanisation, and density. He points to the propitious site selection as a key and Griffin's artistic handling of the key landscape elements, enabling the works of architecture to acquire a sense of naturalness. He notes that when we began to think of the design for Parliament House, the observance of the interdependence between built forms and land forms became a natural assumption, and we conceived our design as an extension of that concept. We knew the site had to be transformed, but it had to preserve the memory of what it had been. Ultimately, they developed principles for the project, focused on a sort of rapport between architecture and land form. The building on the site, and I'm quoting again now, the building on the site should respond to two kinds of rules: the order of the city, from which it derives its symmetry, and the order of the landform. Thus, the building is a kind of bridge between one and the other, end quote. His sense of stewardship for Canberra was powerfully informed by this commitment to the dual and symbiotic role of architecture and nature, buildings and landscape. This tied him to his adopted city and shaped his legacy in Australia. There's a lot more to say on that question, and I've hardly scratched the surface. Giurgola was interested in questions of landscape and settlement in the widest sense. Moreover, he used actual house projects, domestic design projects, to reflect on and reframe the Parliament House project, as Catherine Lasson's new work is highlighting within our research project. But all that will have to wait for another occasion or the book. So what to say then about how Giurgola should be located? Denise and Bill and I have spent some time, as I've mentioned, over the past few days, and as Bill's mentioned, discussing this, and it's no simple matter to locate him definitively in the story of 20th century architecture. Giurgola is at some level postmodern in sensibility, but he eschews irony or any deconstructive intent in his work. He embraces instead an idea of the ongoing validity of architectural tradition. But he's not a traditionalist and regarded modern architecture as a vital tradition of which he was a part. He's in some ways an academic architect who used institutional appointments to build his authority, and reputation. But he leaves those sources of authority behind and those sources of authority and identity behind when given the opportunity to build something of potentially lasting significance. He brings Roman cultural authority to the American architectural scene that seems to have left Rome with little regret or sense of when or how he might return to the place of his birth. This set of tensions or seeming contradictions in his life and work are partly explained by the vicissitudes of career and opportunity. They are, in some sense, arbitrary at some level. And as a talented designer, he simply grasped opportunities and addressed problems that were in front of him. But I also think that he embraced certain tensions and contradictions embedded in his expansive and fragmented itinerary. As much as his work can be put into a productive conversation about the currents of Philadelphia architecture in the 1960s and 1970s, he also evades easy categorization and always eludes particular camps, greys and whites notwithstanding. What his career ultimately allows us to do is track the forms of architectural authority, as well as compositional acuity that could be carried across borders and from one architectural culture to another. So even though he returns again and again to the specific quality of a landform of an urban situation, the key to his biography might be in the moves he makes from one place to another, from Rome to Philadelphia to Canberra. Thank you.
So we certainly have time for questions. And for those of you online, I forgot to say that we can't manage taking questions from Zoom in this context, but questions? We're going to use this microphone.
On Zoom can hear.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you, Cameron, for that lecture. You made a comment at the very beginning about leaving out New York. And I'm just wondering if you could return to that a minute. And why did you leave it out? What did you think did not happen that made it part of this talk? And that's not a pointed question. It's
Yeah, sure.
because I happen to agree with what you did, but I'm
Yeah.
interested what you were thinking.
Just really to suck up to Philadelphians. No. Yeah. In his biography in New York, I think there's no question about that. But if we're trying to or the most significant things.
We'll use this microphone.
Okay, back to this. Our sense is that the formation in Rome is fundamental to who he is. His recollections, his sense of sort of overlaying of memory of what a city should be are formed fundamentally there. I mean, that's not a very original biographical insight to say that someone who grew up there, but he writes in that way about it. It seems that the sort of Philadelphia is the place where the sort of ferment of ideas around what modern architecture should become in the 1950s and 60s is in a way identifiable and fundamental to this next set of questions that he wants to address in his work. And that Canberra takes him to a final place where he gets to exercise most profoundly this sense of how a whole landscape can be sort of condensed and then also sort of represented in a way through an architectural project. So these big key things in his life and understanding him and his work seem to resonate through those three places. And New York just feels a little bit anomalous. It's important to his career, no doubt. But for us, there's a kind of clarity to looking at that itinerary where New York's part of it, but it's a bit like the fact that he got interested in Sweden. It's important to his life, but we would organise, at least at the moment, notionally, a book or an exhibition around those other three cities, the three cities I focused on.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Cameron. This is fantastic. And, I'll sign up for the book even before it's written. It's no matter the price. So when you were speaking in the early part of the talk about the separated facade and how that's reappears in a number of different ways. One of the things that, as my mind wandered a bit through the images you were showing, is that the other thing that's kind of present in some way in all those drawings are grids. And I thought of this question half an hour ago when you were saying that, but maybe in terms of Alan's question about like, maybe there's a thread about what did American cities, kind of what presence did American cities, whether it's the grid of Philadelphia, the grid of New York, had in some of his kind of spatial thinking, whether he was explicit about that as another kind of like controlling tool.
Yeah, it is honestly something I have not thought about, although in a sort of oblique way, pardon the pun. We're talking about yesterday on several occasions, we went past the United Fund building, and the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, and the way he wanted to address the fact that that's off grid is very explicit. And I think he's kind of interested in all of those spatial elements of a city. An underlying grid structure is just one of those things that's fundamental, because he'll argue, and I didn't focus on a lot, I think I mentioned it early on, that each project is in a sense just a fragment or an element that you're contributing. It shouldn't ever simply be the object in itself, that thing that he objected to when he was having the argument with Gordon Bunshaft. And so all those elements, whether it's, that's, I guess, what a grid is in the end, is the underlying framework of public space as opposed to private lot, this cadastral framework. And so how could it not, in a sense, be fundamental to him, given that overall ethic of thinking you're always making, when you're working in the city, an element of the city, not an object separate from it. But beyond that, perhaps someone who's in his firm might have something further to say. I don't know.
Thanks, Cameron. This isn't as much of a question as it is a compliment. One, you helped me understand William Penn High School a lot better through this presentation. And two, you actually heightened my appreciation. I didn't have any appreciation for it, actually. You helped me appreciate Penn Mutual in a way that I hadn't thought about before. And that detached wall is a signifier and a theme and something that repeats, because then I looked up the Columbus High School and I'm like, oh, okay. And I don't think it's like corny that he uses it over and over in different ways. I think it's kind of special, which I'm still trying to grapple with, but I appreciate you highlighting that and bringing it into conversation with Penn Mutual, because I've been taught to hate it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about that. Thank you. You probably give a good 40-minute talk where you really drill down into that as a strategy. And as I mentioned at the start, I wanted to at least just flesh out a few themes in the work before turning to the thing that I guess I'm most interested in, the way it engages with cities and landscape. But yeah, I don't know. It is a repeating motif, and we were talking about it earlier, and I think it's really something that he actually does. I kind of spoke about it as though it sort of does one or two things, but actually the conversations I was having earlier with people and from visiting Tradifferent today, I got a sense, actually, this is a device he's attached to, partly because it does multiple things depending on the particular circumstance. So yeah.
Yeah, again, I'll start with a compliment as well. Your line there at the end about the fact that there is a sort of postmodernism to it, but without the ironic content. really hit me right between the eyes. And but then I also was thinking about, the overlap with Kahn and his interest in the depth of walls and the depth of openings, which the screen wall is part of that story. But somehow he seems to manage to do it without the weightiness, that Kahn's work, the weightiness that Kahn's work has. And looking at the drawings today with down in Bill's den there, there's a paper thinness to it that in the way it's developed, but then it has depth as well. And it's really interesting to me about, just trying to kind of get a handle on how he saw those things. But I think there's something in there, and somehow that helped avoid the irony, even though it's paper flat composition in some ways, and yet it isn't. I just think there's something really fascinating about that kind of interaction.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was something we spoke about again today, and Bill pointed this out on several occasions, because we also went to Erdman Hall at Bryn Mawr, and it's like, look at Kahn's building sitting there, like really heavy in the ground. I don't think he's saying this in a negative way. No bigger. Yeah. After looking at a series of projects that both perhaps, well, in some cases kind of leap off the ground plane in response to changing topography, and the way that Giurgola's projects tend to have that sense of lightness, or a sort of tension between, in some occasions, the sense of sort of massivity of wall and then a kind of thinness, and the sort of more perhaps playing between the light and the heavy, not as deliberate, self-undermining or deconstructive or ironic, I don't think, but I think also more just as sort of compositional tension, perhaps. I don't know, that might be one way of thinking about it.
And we do have a question here, and I think my mic is working.
Thanks, Cameron. This is for you as well as anyone else on the research team. I was wondering how you are preparing to use analytical terms like a global architect or a cosmopolitan architect or a transatlantic or trans-Pacific architect, because he strikes me as he could be all of those things. But when I think of the rise of a global architect, I don't think of Giurgola or his work or what that work represents. So I'm just wondering if you have any preferences.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm not sure if we have preferences. We originally knitted into the grant application the term from Philadelphia school to global practice in order to get at this tension that is involved in a local scene or movement, if you like, or however we want to characterize that thing. And yet is someone who's building by the 80s and 90s, things on the other side of the world, including major complex for the Singapore military, working for corporate headquarters in Gothenburg, in Sweden. So there is a globality to it, but I don't think it really speaks to the modes of practice, perhaps that's supposed to capture, that critics and historians have tried to get at through that use of that concept. But yeah, probably someone else in my team would be better equipped to answer that question. I mean, partly I think that sort of global architecture has perhaps become a bit of a cliche in the discourse about architecture. So we're sort of just like, oh, we'll just park that for now. And I don't think we've yet grappled with what is international itinerary, that I'm often calling it, means with respect to globalization or the globalization of architectural cultures. Because I think he would have certainly disavowed globalization as a thing, given his relentless kind of sense of place specificity as his guiding ethic over and above any theoretical position or alignment with theory or group. And so, yeah, he would disavow it. What we do with it? It's a good question. Thanks.
I think they're, is that?
Where's that question if you want to take that?
Bottom.
So I don't know if people can read it back there, given the size of the text, but Jeremy Foster has sent in a question. I'm curious, when Giurgola became sensitized to the role of landscape in the development of the Canberra Parliament building, in a context which was really quite tabula rasa de novo, at least compared to other Australian cities, would the growing sense of Indigenous land rights have contributed even faintly to that sensibility conversation? Very interesting and difficult question to answer. Aldo recorded a very long interview with Australia's best known historian in the 1980s, Manning Clark, which the transcript for which, no, the actual recording for which is available through the National Library of Australia. And they touch upon some of these themes. And Aldo talks a lot about what it means to settle. And the terms and the way he uses that terminology is, I think, really difficult and troubling from our perspective today, but I think also really sincere in his way of approaching it. He acknowledges the prior and existing entitlement of people, but he still primarily thinks of Canberra as a landscape condition, as a sort of a plan imprinted and begun to be realised through the middle decades of the 20th century. So, yeah, it's not clear that he's engaged with a growing sense, which is mostly based in a kind of militant protest movement in the 70s and 80s in Australia, leading up to the bicentenary of the invasion of Australia in 1788, which we celebrate rather than an actual political moment, because no one really cared that much about the Federation, which I guess was the actual moment of nationhood. And he's building a building that is to be opened in celebration of that moment. But he doesn't talk much about it. And I guess his client probably appreciates him not saying much about it. But I don't really have a lot of evidence for what he thought beyond that conversation with Manning Clark, which is quite rich in its own way, but also, as with many things with Aldo, a little bit aphoristic or something, not quite, it's it's hard to pin down in a way. So he talks about settlement, and it means something quite vague and broad. It means about how people accommodate themselves to a place over time, how they live there. And he's thinking about the settler society, not the Indigenous inhabitants. But he's very interested in the process of what he sees as still a immature settlement in the country, which he, I guess, recognises as a newcomer. So I'm not sure, Jeremy, if that's helped that much, but it's it's something I've been pondering over, and something that's unavoidable and fundamental to the ways we think about all built environment questions in Australia today.
Thank you.